What's going on? Good question. We ask this question ceaselessly at Retro Research. And what we find is that if we just go back a few decades, we can unearth some pretty rich stuff that give us some very important clues, especially if you understand that you have to cut through the hysteria that governs the current political and geopolitical discourse. You got to cut through it. You got to look at things like who uses this term fascism and how do they use it and how do they bandy it about and label people. And you have to understand that it's not just that people are really that stupid. It's worse than that. They're actually being groomed to be stupid in a certain way, and this certain way always works to the advantage of the international finance oligarchy. Look at how the left and right, people, instead of being able to see through it, people are more in the thrall of this pendulum, this pendular thinking, and it gets us really nowhere, keeps us in a hypnotic, like a hysterical trance. If you want to know what fascism is really about, it's a way of organizing society along totalitarian lines, generally like failing states that need a strong authoritative leader. You look at communism, that's generally something that's seeded into and funded and deployed through intelligence networks and banking into countries that are insufficiently devoted to the aims and the objectives of the international finance oligarchy. And what is at the top of both of these? Who decides whether it's fascism or communism or socialism? Who decides, or even libertarianism now, which is equally artificial? Who decides how you dangle the pendulum in different populations, and you mobilize and you set people against each other? And well, above this level of this left-right deception is Synarchism. Synarchism really came about through the fusion of the powerful industrialists of the late 19th century and the powerful bankers, and the fusion of this newly emerged powerful privileged set with the aristocracy, the old aristocracy, and how they found use for one another in governing society or getting control of every aspect of society, including epistemological, including how people think about things. And then you could create a control grid that would leave nothing to chance, and you could guide society along the lines that you variously, people will call it communism or people call it fascism. But essentially, the train is going down one track. You have a left track and a right track, but it's the synarchists who keep things going. So here we have, helping us get clear about these things, again, Executive Intelligence Review, Volume 30, Number 21, May 30th, 2003. So, 22, 23 years ago, we'll look at this through the lens of what today we're seeing in terms of forced immigration and globalism. You see how just 23 years ago or so, it was associated with an extreme right movement. Now it's associated with an extreme left movement. I think they figured out that socialism is probably the cheaper way to corral everybody into a kind of human zoo. But you look back a few years and you see things being organized along very different ideological lines, but the objective is the same. That's what we need to take away. This is called Synarchism, the Fascist Roots of the Wolfowitz Cabal, by Jeffrey Steinberg, the great Jeffrey Steinberg. We'll start by talking about Kalergi, Coudenhove Kalergi. You see him coming up a lot in on Facebook and other places as people associate with him with some sort of wild-eyed Jewish conspiracy, which it isn't that. It's something else. It's not a far-left Jewish conspiracy. It's a synarchist, international financier, oligarchy / aristocracy agenda that's a permutation, or it's an iteration on what they've been doing for centuries. I'll begin. In 1922, Count Richard Coudenhove Kalergi launched the Pan-European Union at a founding convention in Vienna attended by more than 6,000 delegates, railing against the Bolshevist menace in Russia. The Venetian Count, called for the dissolution of all the nation-states of Western Europe and the erection of a single European feudal state modeled on the Roman and Napoleonic empires. So this is fascinating. We go back 100 years and we see essentially the same program that they're trying to push through today. And tragically, we see people caught up in left and right ideologies, not understanding that these are just fictions, guys. And the destruction of the nation state through forced immigration, this was in the works back then, but instead of, today, it's viewed as a kind of neo-Bolshevik project of wild-eyed Jews. We see that it actually has always been a plot of the synarchists. So going on, and instead of a kind of socialist utopia / dystopia where you'll own nothing and be happy and eat bugs, you have here single European feudal state, a return to the glorious medieval times modeled on the Roman and Napoleonic empires. Very different vision, but essentially the same exact thing. Quote, there are Europeans, Coudenhove Kalergi warned, who are, quote, naive enough to believe that the opposition between the Soviet Union and Europe can be bridged by the inclusion of the Soviet Union in the United States of Europe. These Europeans need only to glance at the map to persuade themselves that the Soviet Union in its immensity can, with the help of the Communist Third International, very quickly prevail over little Europe. To receive this Trojan horse into the European Union would lead to perpetual civil war and the extermination of European culture. So long, therefore, as there is any will to survive, subsisting in Europe, the idea of linking Soviet Union with Pan-Europe must be rejected. It would be nothing less than the suicide of Europe. So that should strike people as odd. It's sort of like the exact opposite of the view of the Kalergi plan as people popularly try to understand it today. today it's understood as a deliberate destruction of European culture and a deliberate suicide or euthanasia of Europe, of European culture through forced immigration. But you see back then, and it's going along the same track, it had a completely different ideological cast. So, and the idea of crushing individual nation states and ethnic regions and linguistic regions and these sort of organic regional differences by kind of homogenizing them through forced immigration and technocratic control, you would see then a world more readily and easily governed by an international finance oligarchy and an aristocracy that would have even more control than ever, have even more power to exploit human energies and human creativity, and have a stranglehold on progress and resources. Elsewhere, Coudenhove-Kalergi echoed the contemporaneous writings of British Fabian roundtable devotees H.G. Wells and Lord Bertrand Russell. This is the essence of synarchy. You know, the Fabians is usually associated with socialism. Declaring, quote, "This eternal war can end only with the constitution of a world republic. The only way left to save peace seems to be a politic of peaceful strength on the model of the Roman Empire that succeeded in having the longest period of peace in the West thanks to the supremacy of his legions," unquote. The launching of the Pan-European Union was bankrolled by the Venetian-rooted European banking family, the Warburgs. Max Warburg, scion of the German branch of the family, I think the Italian branch was called Del Banco, gave Coudenhove-Kalergi 60,000 gold marks to hold the founding convention. Even more revealing, the first mass rally of the Pan-European Union in Berlin at the Reichstag was addressed by Hjalmar Schacht, later the Reichsbank head, economics minister and chief architect of the Hitler coup. A decade later, in October 1932, Schacht delivered a major address before another Pan-Europa event in which he assured Coudenhove-Kalergi and the others, "In 3 months Hitler will be in power. Hitler will create Pan-Europa. Only Hitler can create Pan-Europa." And of course, this project is later revived in the 80s, where it was seriously discussed to the revival of the Holy Roman Empire, with the hub of it being the Austro-Hungarian Empire and under the leadership of Otto von Habsburg. And they actually had there were two basic ideas. Either they were going to create another fascist dictator like Hitler to preside over this project, or it would be an aristocrat, and Otto von Habsburg was the prime candidate for that. According to historical documents, Italy's fascist dictator Benito Mussolini was initially skeptical about the Pan-Europa idea, but was won over to the scheme following a meeting with Coudenhove-Kalergi, during which, in the Count's words, quote, "I gave him a complete harvest of Nietzsche's quotes for the United States of Europe. My visit represented a shift in the behavior of Mussolini towards Pan-Europa. His opposition disappeared." So look at social media, take a survey, look how often Nietzsche is invoked by all sorts of people. We should be very suspicious. We should begin to shape a more realistic view of what he represents. At the founding Congress of the Pan-European Union in Vienna, the backdrop behind the podium was adorned with portraits of the movement's leading intellectual icons: Immanuel Kant, Napoleon Bonaparte, Giuseppe Mazzini, and Friedrich Nietzsche. Bankers' fascism, the pivotal role of Schacht in the Hitler coup and the Pan-European Union highlights a critical dimension of the universal fascist scheme, now the universal socialist scheme. The top-down, I was just thinking of Mamdani's, the newly installed Democrat, whatever he is, installed as mayor of New York, where he kind of postured as a very humble, soft-spoken little man, and then he's exploded on the scene with his oratorical flourishes and what's the word I want? It was just so over the top. His statements, his speech, it was just a bit shocking. Unapologetic socialist. He is exactly a product of exactly what we're reading about here, which, you know, you go back to this period 100 years ago, 80 years ago, up until the 1980s, it was generally regarded that fascism would be the main motivating force for exactly the same thing. The top-down role of the financial overworld and its banking technocrats. That's essentially what Synarchy is about. But perhaps different from the older version in which you had the Venetian Republic, so-called Republic, wielding a form of financial terrorism over all of Europe and just raking in profits and just wrecking economies. This intends to do basically the same thing, but sort of lull the populations into a kind of Brave New World scenario under a socialist banner, right? But it's essentially the same thing going on. By all historical accounts, Schacht was the architect in 1930 of the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, the Central Bank of Central Banks, along with the Bank of England's Montague Norman, Hitler's banker. Historian Carol Quigley, in his epic book, Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, 1966, I think he was Bill Clinton's mentor, described the BIS scheme to establish a dictatorship over world finance. Quote, "The powers of financial capital had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences." So isn't that really the system of control? While everyone is hypnotized or stirred to frenzies with these ideological terms in the public discourse, and reacting and lashing out, this is essentially what we have. We still live under feudalism, and you have central banks instead of the central bank. What was it? The Fondi of Venice, the St. Mark's, I think, being the main one. Now you have a global network of central banks, which through fraudulent tax contracts rakes in billions and billions to the Bank for International Settlements that launders money and finances criminal operations, et cetera, et cetera. Very similar to the way the Venetians did. Do you hear my cat? She needs some attention. I don't know what her problem is. So let me read that again. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank in the hands of men like Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, Charles Rist of the Bank of France, Hjalmar Schacht of the Reichsbank, sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world, unquote. So there you have synopsis of what has remained a constant. It's kind of a modern technocratic framing of it, but if you watch more of these videos on this channel, you will see it goes back a good ways, essentially undisturbed. Modus operandi. Quigley highlighted the role of Schacht's closest ally in the BIS scheme, Bank of England Governor Norman, who headed the privately owned British institution for an unprecedented 24 years. 1920 to 1944. Quote, Norman was a strange man, Quigley reported, whose mental outlook was one of successfully suppressed hysteria or even paranoia. He had no use for governments and feared democracy. Both of these seemed to him to be threats to private banking and thus to all that was proper and precious in human life. Strong-willed, tireless, and ruthless, he viewed his life as a kind of cloak and dagger struggle with the forces of unsound money, which were in league with anarchy and communism, pulling all the strings everywhere. Montague Norman and Hjalmar Schacht personified the banking overworld that bankrolled and installed Hitler and the Nazis in power and in pursuit of their larger universal fascist scheme. Even more damning were the profiles of Schacht and Norman in their role in the Hitler Project. In The Hitler Book by a Schiller Institute research team headed by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, 1984, quote, the BIS, nominally set up after the breakdown of normal international financial relations in order to prevent a downward spiraling of international payments, in fact, finished off the hapless Weimar Republic with its stern refusal to come to the help of a virtually bankrupt Germany in the crucial summer of 1931, after the Donat Bank collapse had brought the whole nation to its knees. Schacht, who had been a member of the original BIS team and was to return to its board from 1933 through 1938, had been campaigning since his 1930 resignation as head of the Reichsbank for Anglo-American support for a takeover by the NSDAP Nazi Party and its leader, Herr Hitler. He had resigned on the 7th of March 1930, and the BIS was formally established in June. In September, he was off to London and the United States to sell the Nazi option to the Anglo-American leadership, notably Bank of England Governor and BIS Director Montague Norman, and the already influential Dulles Brothers of Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, one of America's most influential, and the attorneys for I.G. Farben, and many other large German companies and provincial governments. Schacht's Hamburg friend and colleague, patrician Nazi Gerhard Westrick, ran the correspondent law firm to Dulles's in Germany. Unquote. On the 16th of March 1933, a grateful Hitler brought Schacht back as head of the Reichsbank explained the Hitler book. A year later, Schacht was made economics minister. Quote, now the BIS was going to help the Third Reich. By 1939, it had no less than several hundred million Swiss gold francs invested in Germany. On the BIS board were Baron Kurt von Schröder, by now a general in the SS Death's Head Brigade, Dr. Hermann Schmitz of IG Farben, whom Schacht had trained at the Imperial Economics Ministry from 1915 on, and later Hitler's two personal appointees, Walter Funk and Emil Pohl of the Reichsbank, unquote. File Synarchist/Nazi-communist. Here we go. The larger universal fascist schema into which the Norman Schacht Hitler project fit was well known to leading American intelligence, military, and diplomatic figures of the Franklin Roosevelt era, who maintained exhaustive files under such headings as Synarchist/Nazi-communist. There's Leo Strauss, hardcore synarchist Alexandra Koyev, and sent his students to Koyev to study the value of purgative violence. Purgative violence, the value of it. Something to follow up on? That's creepy. U.S. government archives from the FDR era, which were made available to EIR researchers. Keep that in mind. Trust sources that go to archives and get original documents. Feature extensive intelligence reports on the international fascist plots from the files of the U.S. State Department, U.S. Army Intelligence and Navy Intelligence, the Coordinator of Information. I haven't heard of that. What's that? COI? And its successor, the Office of, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, became the CIA after they purged the pro-Roosevelt people and it replaced them with very pro-British, pro-Dulles people. These files are of immediate relevance today, given the ongoing coup d'etat in Washington by the disciples of Leo Strauss, Alexandra Koyev, and Carl Schmitt inside the George W. Bush administration. Koyev, I don't know who this person is, I'm probably mispronouncing it, and Schmitt were leading figures in the wartime synarchist conspiracy, and they personified the perpetuation of that universal fascist plan and apparatus into the post-war period. Already, following EIR's lead, major American and European newspapers have identified such putschists as Paul Wolfowitz, these are the neocons, right? Abram Schulsky, William Crystal, John Ashcroft, Steve Cambone, guess that's how you say it. Gary Schmitt is the offspring of the late University of Chicago professor Leo Strauss. Strauss, in turn, was the lifelong collaborator and promoter of Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, official Nazi philosopher and Nietzsche revivalist Martin Heidegger, and the French synarchist Alexander Koyev. He's of the French synarchist. All unabashed advocates of tyranny as the only appropriate form of government. Although the May 4th Sunday New York Times feature offhandedly mentions Koyev as Strauss's colleague without further identification, all of the major media coverage has been sanitized of any discussion of the overtly fascist synarchist roots of the Straussian creed. Of course, today, that's gone, you know. They're pushing the idea that everything is socialist, and nobody knows a damn thing about synarchism. Nobody can remember anything more than 2 years ago. Nevertheless, there are growing indications that some elements within the U.S. political institutions, particularly military and intelligence communities, which comprise an important element of what Lyndon LaRouche refers to as the institution of the US presidency, are waking up to the cruel reality that a small group of universal fascists has seized the reins of power and is steering an ill-equipped President George W. Bush, the United States, and the rest of the world into a maelstrom, perpetual war, and chaos. Of course, it was inevitable because the Bushes are in fact related. They come from there's the von den Busche family, I think it's in Bavaria, certainly German. So they're being pulled and swept along by European aristocracy. This is the underlying, this is what even this article won't touch on. So none of this, it's not like he's being swept along by the currents and doesn't know what's going on. No, there is the aristocratic undercurrent that's the strongest and sweeping, not like chaotically, not at all. A timely review of the history of the 20th century Synarchists is, therefore, in order to enable those political circles already shocked into action, to understand the nature of the enemy and exploit the greatest weakness of these Straussian would-be putschists, their open embrace of universal fascism, otherwise known as Synarchism. So I would just add that they haven't embraced it, they are it, they've been it for many, many generations. And it's not a weakness. So I think this last paragraph is a bit naive. The Langer study, as EIR reported on 9th of May, Dick Cheney has a French connection to fascism. Big surprise. In 1947, OSS veteran Harvard professor William L. Langer assembled the official history of the Roosevelt administration's dealings with Vichy France. Our Vichy gamble was based on an exhaustive review of wartime archives buttressed by interviews with top American officials, including OSS head General William Donovan. That's Wild Bill Donovan, and President Franklin Roosevelt himself. Langer minced no words in discussing the Synarchist circles in Vichy France, referring to Admiral Jean-François Darlan, who, along with Pierre Laval, was among the most notorious of the Vichy collaborationists with the Nazis. Langer wrote, Darlan's henchmen were not confined to the fleet. His policy of collaboration with Germany could count on more than enough eager supporters among French industrial and banking interests. In short, among those who even before the war had turned to Nazi Germany and had looked to Hitler as the savior of Europe from communism. These people were as good fascists as any in Europe. Many of them had long had extensive and intimate business relations with German interests and were still dreaming of a new system of synarchy, which meant government of Europe on fascist principles by an international brotherhood of financiers and industrialists. So maybe you'll flash forward to today and look at how that looks with Ursula von der Leyen and these coke-addled lunatics in Brussels. This is what it looks like, the next generation. EIR is in possession of many of the documents that Langer reviewed in preparing our Vichy gamble. They offer an in-depth study of a fascist apparatus whose European-wide tentacles extended into France, Germany, Britain, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and across the Atlantic inside the United States. One particularly revealing document prepared by the Coordinator of Information in November 1940 focused on the Synarchist strategy toward England and America. The document was called Synarchy and the Policy of the Bank Worms Group. The unnamed author began, quote, In recent reports, there have been several references to the growing political power of the Banque Worms group in France. I'm saying it wrong, I just not getting it right today, which includes amongst its members such ardent collaborationists as Pouchot, Benoist Machin, Leroy Ladurie, Boutier, and representatives of big French industrial organizations, unquote. Under the subtitle Similarity of Aims of Synarchy and Banque Worms, the report continued, the reactionary movement known as Synarchy has been in existence in France for nearly a century. Its aim has always been to carry out a bloodless revolution inspired by the upper classes, aimed at producing a form of government by technicians, under which home and foreign policy would be subordinated to international economy. The aims of the Banque Worms group are the same as those of Synarchy, and the leaders of the two groups are, in most cases, identical, unquote. The Banque Worms group was closely allied with the Lazard banking interests in Paris, London, and New York, with Royal Dutch Shell's Henri d'Etterding. Hippolyte Worms, the bank's founder, was one of 12 initial synarchist movement of empire members, SME, according to other French police and intelligence reports. The report itemized the aims of the synarchists as of August 1940, quote, to check any new social schemes which might tend to weaken the power of the international financiers and industrialists, to work for the ultimate complete control of all industry by international finance and industry, to protect Jewish and Anglo-Saxon interests, to take advantage of Franco-German collaboration to conclude a series of agreements with German industries, thereby establishing a solid community of interest between French and German industrialists, which will tend to strengthen the hands of international finance and industry to effect a fusion with Anglo-Saxon industry after the war. The authority of the COI study reported, quote, there is a reason to believe that both Hermann Göring and Dr. Walter Funk are in sympathy with these aspirations, and that some headway is claimed to have been made in securing the adhesion of big U.S. industry to the movement. Beaverbrook and Hoare. The COI studies segment regarding policy in regard to Great Britain elaborated the following synarchist plan: to bring about the fall of the Churchill government by creating the belief in the country that a more energetic government is needed to prosecute the war. It is recognized that an effective means of creating suspicion of the government's efficiency would be to induce the resignation of Lord Beaverbrook, to bring about the formation of a new government, including Sir Samuel Hoare, Lord Beaverbrook, and Mr. Hoare Belisha. Note, sources added that in the Worms group it is believed that those circles in Great Britain who are favorably disposed to their plan, are most critical of Mr. Churchill, Lord Halifax, and Captain Margeson. Through the medium of Sir Samuel Hoare, to bring about an agreement between British industry and the Franco-German bloc, to protect Anglo-Saxon interests on the continent, to reach an agreement for the cessation of the reciprocal bombing of industrial centers. Note, the sources added that Göring is reputed to have signified his entire approval of this project, unquote. Let's jump ahead. Let's jump ahead to the end. Synarchism defined. Among the thousands of documents that EIR obtained from the U.S. wartime archives was an 18-page French military intelligence report summarizing a 100-page dossier on the French Synarchist groups dated July 1941. The report dealt with the Synarchist movement of empire, SME, could be the WEF today, the Synarchist Revolutionary Convention, the SRC, and the Secret Committee of Revolutionary Action, the military leadership arm of the SME, also known as the Cagoulards, the hooded ones. And you can bet that there's a correlating organization or groups hidden more or less or not going on today. The report provided a brief summary. The Synarchist movement is an international movement born after the Versailles Treaty, which was financed and directed by certain financial groups belonging to the top international banking community. Its aims is essentially to overthrow in every country where they exist the parliamentary regimes which are considered insufficiently devoted to the interest of these groups and therefore too difficult to control because of the number of persons required to control them. SME proposes therefore to substitute them by authoritarian regimes more docile and more easily maneuverable. So you see, authoritarianism is, in the eyes of the Synarchists, the real rulers of the planet. These are the docile groups. These are the docile elements. You see how people have been so misled. Power would be concentrated in the hands of the CEOs of industry and in designated representatives of chosen banking groups for each country. In a word, the idea is to give each country a political constitution and an appropriate national economic structure organized for the following purposes. 1. Place the political power directly into the hands of chosen people and eliminate all intermediaries. 2. Establish a maximum concentration of industries and suppress all unwarranted competition. 3. Establish an absolute control of prices of all goods, raw materials, semi-finished or finished goods. 4. Create judicial and social institutions that would prevent all extremes of action. The dossier, unquote, the dossier reported that following failed Cagoulard insurrections in 1934 and 37, the SME infiltrated all the economic and related ministries of the French government, conducted sabotage from within the regime, and set the basis for the Vichy government of 1940, which was dominated from top to bottom by Synarchist secret society members. The report named 40 top officials of the government of Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain, who were all SME members. Who talks about the SME today? Nobody. The dossier repeatedly emphasized that the French SME was but one component of an international Synarchist apparatus, quote, organized and financed in all countries by certain elements of industrial CEOs and high banking circles. Its objective on the international level is to subvert all of the democratic regimes in the world and substitute them with stronger governments, more docile, and whose leaders of command in each nation are centralized in the hands of a number of affiliates belonging to big business and international banking interests, which coordinate their activities around the world. In France, under the Vichy regime, noted the dossier, the main administrations of the country have become the arms of Bank Worms, whose administrative council controls all the top administrators of the state. Just this last part. The Synarchists did not concentrate all their efforts on infiltrating and controlling the Vichy regime. A U.S. military intelligence report dated the 27th July 1944 from a military attaché in Algiers warned of Synarchist penetration of the upper echelons of the Free French government of General Charles de Gaulle, headquartered in Algeria. And then we'll stop. Just to show you the reach, the scope, the ubiquitousness of this pernicious, tentacled creature. Some of the oldest and formerly most faithful supporters of General de Gaulle are worried by what they call a tendency to let Synarchism penetrate even the highest brackets of the Algiers administration. We'll stop there. I think that gives really good background. I encourage you to find the article and dig more deeply into Synarchism and what it implies. And mostly, of course, mostly my aim is to encourage people to look into the recent past and find clues that make you go, oh my God, we're seeing this today. They're just changing some of the terms around.